Sometime during your life, in fact, very soon, you may find yourself listening to a podcast, and you may notice that the first spoken line can often tell you what sort of podcast you're hearing. If the first line is a satirical take on the novel's introduction, for example, you may find that the podcast delights in poking fun at the style in which the novel was written. If, on the other hand, you find that the first line is a sincere homage to said novel, you may find the podcast is celebrating the unique style in which the novel was written.
That's great. We need to come up with a first line for this podcast.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because it really can say a lot, and I have no idea how to start this otherwise.
I don't know either. And we have to figure out whether we're going to be doing a satirical approach or whether we're going to do a sincere homage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We'll think about that. And maybe sometime in the middle of the podcast, we'll come up with the introductory line for the podcast.
Right. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, because you can put in a first line anywhere. The first line of a podcast doesn't have to be the very first line of a podcast. It could show up anywhere within the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, like 3 minutes in, 10 minutes in, whatever.
Sure. Maybe even in the next one, then we'll have the introductory line for this one.
Right. Yeah.
Because why not? Hello and welcome to Woeful Wednesdays. Nathan reads a series of unfortunate events. Ignore the tattoo. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Tyler.
And we are talking about Book the Fourth, The Miserable Mill, and we are looking at chapters 1 to 4 for this week. And if you did not catch the intro,
damage.
Yeah, I know we both have got pretty banged up copies, so well loved, let's say, or loathed and despised, because like we both have got copies from the library, so.
Right.
I don't know what that says about kids who've been reading these books, whether they love it so much and they've just been hugging it and that's why it's all banged up, or whether they just have been throwing it across the room. But in any case, at least the spine has been cracked. Do you ever like look at a book like that in the library and you're like, no one's even opened this, and then you feel so sad. You're like, oh.
Yeah.
I've bought a lot of used books like that too, where you like pull it out, you're like, this is brand new. You're like, this was a gift somebody got and they were not a reader.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
And I understand that we do have a sponsor for today's episode.
Yeah, we sure do. So our sponsor for today is Ocular Chewing Gum. Listen, folks, after a long day of work, or at least a long morning of work, why not rejuvenate your mind, body, and soul with some nice chewing gum? That's why you need to look to the industry leaders of chewing gum, preferred by lumber mill professionals all around the world. Ocular Chewing Gum. When you've got your eye on flavor, look to Ocular Chewing Gum.
That is amazing. Wow, I have not heard of them, but you know what? I definitely have to try that now.
Yeah, that's because you don't have an eye for flavor. That's why you haven't noticed.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Right. Ignore the Ocular Chewing Gum.
Yes. Oh, man. Great to have them as a sponsor.
Yeah, me too. And I really do prefer that over having an actual meal for lunch. It's a great substitute. Just as good. Yeah. All right, folks, I hope you enjoy. Ignore the tattoo! Nathan unfortunately reads a series of unfortunate events at an unfortunate age, which in this case is being used to indicate that he is entirely too old to be reading this for the first time. All right, so we were talking about Book the Fourth, The Miserable Mill. I have got the plot summary duties for the first 4 chapters. So basically, the book starts out with Klaus, Violet, and Sunny, and they are traveling on a train through the finite forest. Mr. Poe is accompanying them. He is taking them to meet their new guardian in this lumber mill, this lumber town, and does it say that he's the owner of it?
Or just... I believe so.
Okay. Yeah. And their new guardian has got an unpronounceable name, so I'm just going to call him Cthulhu. H.P. Lovecraft of the unpronounceable monster. And so their new guardian is Count Cthulhu, and or something with an unpronounceable name. And then they arrive there, and it's a super strange town. Mr. Poe, of course, cannot stay because I guess the train just arrives in town and then just goes back from whichever direction it came from, because it only stops there once a day, and he can't possibly be bothered to see these children, including an infant. He can't possibly be bothered to actually make sure that they get in touch with this guardian. How is he even finding these guardians is baffling.
Yeah. Oh, Mr. Poe. I'm kind of glad that we don't get to spend too much time with him, though, that he's just like, never mind, you're useless anyway.
Right. Yeah. So, in any case, he drops them off. They then arrive in town. They see this mill, the Lucky Smells Lumbermill. Mm-hmm. And you've got the post office in town with a shoe instead of a flag on the flagpole. And then they realize that the lettering on the actual gate for Lucky Smells Lumbermill is old chewing gum, right?
Yep.
I'm pretty sure that's ocular chewing gum that's on there, right? Just as good the second time you chew it. And I'm continuing to advocate for our sponsor. In any case, they get in there. They go into the. They see a letter on the ground. Once they're inside the actual lumber mill,
you didn't mention the other building in town.
I'll get to it, but
okay.
Yeah. So they see the letter on the ground. They go into the actual what is it? Dormitory. Yeah. So they get into the dormitory. Apparently, nobody has knocked on the door in 14 years.
Right.
Which seems strange. But in any case, everybody, like, there's a bunch of weird kooks who work in there. They all work for coupons instead of money, and they continue to work there despite this, which makes no sense. They can't purchase anything. I guess they get nothing for breakfast, chewing gum for lunch, and then a casserole for dinner. And then they work in these dangerous conditions, and they're like, oh, you're children, you're going to work here? And it's like, yep. They're like, that's weird, but okay. And you're going to live in the dormitory? That's weird, but okay. And so then the kids actually do start working in there. And then they meet the owner, Mr. Cthulhu, or whatever his name is, who's got the unpronounced... Yeah, sir. He's like, yeah, just call me sir, with the unpronounceable name and the unimaginable face, because we can't even see his face because he's smoking all the time. So, but they are thrown off a little bit by his business partner, Charles, who seems kind, and he's got this library, but no books in it. I feel like that is like, it sounds like such a euphemism for like a crazy person, you know? He's got a library, but no books in it. Right. Doesn't it sound like that?
Yeah, he's a few books short of a catalog.
That's right. Exactly. And in any case, then, yeah, they are hoping that that's going to actually be their guardian, because he's appalled by the fact that they're working in there, sleeping in the dormitory and all of that. But of course, that doesn't matter. And then they do have the foreman who's in charge of all of the workers. Let me get his name here. Foreman Flacutono, which of course is an anagram for Count Olaf. So you have all of that. And of course, as you were alluding to, then there is the building in town that is shaped like an eye, and they are very unsettled by this because it certainly looks like the tattoo that Count Olaf has on his ankle.
Yeah, very interesting detail there in town. So I don't know about you, but within these first 4 chapters, not a lot seems to happen.
No, there's really not.
They arrive, they do some work. They meet some people, but that's it.
Yeah, it's surprising, and that ends up being a good amount of the book. More than a quarter of the book is right there, because that takes us up to page 61. Yep. And so it's like a full third of the book, and we don't really have much of anything going on. So
we even have 2.5 pages describing what the first line of a book can be.
Right. Yeah. So why don't we start there? Yeah. In chapter 1, you definitely get this playfulness with narrative. And so, he starts out And he says, sometime during your life, in fact, very soon, you may find yourself reading a book, and you may notice that a book's first sentence can often tell you what sort of story your book contains. For instance, and then he gives these different examples on here. And then on the next page, on page 2, he says, but this book begins with the sentence, the Baudelaire orphans looked out the grimy window of the train and gazed at the gloomy blackness of the finite forest, wondering if their lives would ever get any better. And then he continues on from there. It's just like, oh, that's the first line in the middle of page 2. And he's just saying, that's the first line of the book. And so I think for a lot of kids, when they're reading this, I think they're just like, can he do that? He just did that.
Right. Yeah.
Like, what a genius that he's really playing with it.
And then, of course, on page 3, we get the line once again.
Yes.
So now that I've told you that the first sentence will be, the Baudelaire orphans looked out the grimy window of the train and gazed at the gloomy blackness of the finite forest, wondering if their lives would ever get any better. If you wish to avoid an unpleasant story, you had best put this book down. The Baudelaire orphans looked at, and we get it again.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the things that he's doing, aside from just the general silliness of playing around with the first line, is he is now conflating, like it's all blended together, an introduction by the author or by the narrator in this case, or a foreword by the author or the persona of Lemony Snicket. It's just all blended together.
Right.
That you could say, this is the start of the story, but here's a foreword before we get to that. I should tell you all of these things in advance before we start reading the actual book itself. But it's almost like Lemony Snicket doesn't know how to do that. So it's just all blended together. Like, he doesn't have any help from an editor, and he doesn't understand the form of what a novel can do.
No, it is very interesting. And I got to tell you, it doesn't really work for me. This whole passage, that I'm just like, yeah, all right, let's just get into the story. And it definitely does feel to me like he didn't really know how to start this particular book.
Right. It's sort of like what Michael Scott says of, the first line of a speech is the most important. That's why I like to have like 3 or 4.
Right.
He just has like 3 or 4 opening jokes. And he just, that didn't work. Let me try another. And I do want to make it clear, because I think you could say that Handler maybe didn't know how to start the story. But for anybody who has not been watching or listening to our previous discussions up until this point, then we've been very careful about making a distinction between Handler, the actual author, and Lemony Snicket, the persona of the narrator that he is taking on. And so Snicket is not Handler, right? That Snicket doesn't seem to know the difference. Snicket is not the sharpest narrator you're ever going to read. He's really not, a terribly insightful author, that he makes all kinds of mistakes when it comes to expressions and insights. And sometimes he gets it and sometimes he doesn't, kind of like an Amelia Bedelia type of character. But that doesn't mean that Handler doesn't know, because Handler is playing around, I think, with the foreword and introduction and the actual start of a story. But this persona that he's taking on just doesn't even know. And then as far as the overall effect, taking an evaluative approach to this, like, does it work? And I'm like, I agree with you. It doesn't work for me. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I see what you're doing. It's not really that funny, but okay. But I think a lot of kids would like this. And I think in part because I've read a lot of, I read a lot. I really do read a lot. And so this doesn't feel novel or exciting, and I've never seen this before. It's I've seen stuff like this kind of playfulness that you can get with the form of a narrative, and it's fine.
So of course we should mention that the first line of this novel is actually sometime during your life, in fact very soon, you may find yourself reading a book, and you may notice that a book's first sentence can often tell you what sort of story your book contains. And that in and of itself does actually really describe what sort of story you're about to read. The way that this novel is written, that sets it up really, really well. You're going to have a lot of these I guess, narrational asides that
Yes.
are going to come up. And I think that that actually does work, but it's just interesting to see that like in the fourth book. um,
Yes. And
yeah.
that's where I think when people the criticism of the books is that they are repetitive. It's not just that they're formulaic in terms of the plot, but
Mhm.
these clever little things that Snicket is saying, it's yeah, you've already established that you're a clever narrator.
Right.
Like we get it. We
Yeah.
get the fact that you're going to speak directly to us, the readers, and it's all going to be kind of facetious with a wink and a smile, and oh hey, this is how reading works. This is how books work.
Yeah.
Um, I do have more to say with chapter one, but
Mhm.
I want to connect it to a section from chapter four. So I'm fine moving on to chapter two if you are.
I mean, I have a few notes in chapter one as well. Um, but uh, but if you wanted to come back to those,
No,
is
no, no.
that
You
what
can
you?
you can go through yours.
Okay. So on page five, I just wanted to note that I absolutely love this. The main paragraph there, like the lower half, and it says, Mr. Poe was a banker who had been in charge of managing the Baudelaire affairs since the fire, and I must tell you that he was not doing a very good job. Yes. I'm so glad that we get that that aside from uh yeah, that point of insight from Lemony Snicket because it's just like, yep, thank you. Thank you for saying what we have all been
Is it
thinking.
insight? If it's that obvious, like, doesn't
Right.
insight require it to be something that's subtle that would get overlooked? It's
Right,
so
that's
smack
fair.
you in the face that he's so awful at this.
Yeah.
That to me, I look at that and I'm like, you could say it, but you're not really offering us anything that we don't already know. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
terrible at this.
Right. I'm just glad that we're getting it laid out, so I guess the idea that Lemony Snicket realizes that Mr.
Right.
Poe isn't
Yes. If even Lemony
isn't
Snicket can
helpful.
recognize that, then
Right. Yeah.
okay.
It's also a bit of just an understatement. Yeah, he's not doing a very good job. He's doing a terrible job.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, my next point was on page 9. Uh, we get the description of all of uh, Count Olaf's horrible associates. The hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, two women with white powder all over their faces, and that rather chubby one who looks like neither a man nor a woman. So it's interesting that now Mr. Poe is also identifying that character as looking like neither a man nor a woman.
Yep.
Um, but uh, but yeah, just I think that it's good that we get because I think that there were more that were seen in the first book, but these are really the ones that have stuck around, uh, and
Right.
that we'll continue to see. So it's good to see those descriptions, just narrowing that down.
Hmm.
Um, and all right, on page 12, let me see. Oh yes, then we get this little aside by Lemony Snicket that says, "Other than a sign I once saw that said 'Beware' in letters made of dead monkeys, the Lucky Smells Lumbermill sign was the most disgusting sign on earth." Oh my goodness, what an image!
I've seen that sign before. Yeah, no, that's a yeah. Okay, dead monkeys. Oh my.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's just more of, Lemony Snicket has led such an interesting life, and I just want to read about his life?
Right. Right.
But seriously, that is quite the image for the first chapter of this book. And I know that this is the fourth book in the series, but it's still, I don't know, it still stood out to me.
No, I mean it stands out to me as well. It's an interesting inclusion that he has here. Um, and I feel like if we did get more about Lemony Snicket, then I feel like it would be very tiresome. I think it
Yeah, that's true.
works. I think it works when you just have this. it's just punctuating the text every now and
Yeah.
then, like a little bit of seasoning of, oh, there's got to be a story there. But I think if you heard the story, you go, oh, that wasn't as good as I thought it was in my head. Because we're now
Mm.
imagining what kind of scenario would ever and result in dead monkey body spelling out the words beware.
Right. Yeah. But yes, those were my only thoughts for chapter one.
Okay, great. All right, on to chapter two. And yeah, the other strange thing, because you do have the picture at the beginning, the illustration at the beginning of chapter two with the newspapers all stacked up. I forgot to mention that's what lines the sidewalks there.
Right.
Just old
Yeah.
newspapers, which I don't even really know what to make of that.
I think that it's more or less a commentary on the fact that, there is this lumber mill, which, like, I suppose, like, they could be, well, they're not making paper, though.
Yeah, it's not a
As I was
pulp
going to say,
mill.
right, yeah. If it were a pulp mill, then I think that would be a very, you know, uh, ironic, point there where
Right.
they're working so hard to make this paper, which is then just sitting there doing nothing.
Yes. Yeah. I honestly I don't know what to make of it. I'm like, okay, that's
Hmm,
interesting. I mean, it's like that's definitely a lumber product, like or a lumber byproduct,
right.
I guess.
Yeah.
But because the illustration that you have there, it looks like a whole bunch of pencils standing straight up.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and then the newspapers beside it, and it's just here are lumber and lumber byproducts all in this town that there's an abundance of these things, but they don't really have much value.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. No, very interesting inclusion there.
yeah. Um, all right. I've got just a couple notes in this one. So one of them is on page 26 then, and I've already mentioned this, but Foreman Flacutono, right, where we
Hmm.
get his name, and that being Count Olaf. And I'm
Yep.
presuming that actually is Count Olaf, this guy where he's got the surgical mask and he's bald, and he, mysteriously took over after the foreman who had been there for an extended period of time suddenly quit. Was that it? He quit.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
so yeah, that's on page 26. So all right, good. We've
Hmm.
introduced Count Olaf into the story, and then there's this funny little discussion about an optimist from 26 to 27, where it
Hmm.
says that this is kind of the middle of that paragraph towards the bottom of 26. The children could tell from Phil's statement about everything and everybody having a good side that he was an optimist. Optimist is a word here which refers to a person such as Phil who thinks hopeful and pleasant thoughts about nearly everything. For instance, if an optimist had his left arm chewed off by an alligator, he might say in a pleasant and hopeful voice, well, this isn't too bad. I don't have my left arm anymore, but at least nobody will ever ask me whether I'm right handed or left handed. But most of us would say something more along the lines of, ah, my arm, my arm.
Yes.
And it's funny. So does that mean then that if an alligator bit off your arm and you scream, ah, my arm, that Snicket would then say, so you're a pessimist. Got it.
Right.
Because that seems to be the implication here. And there's almost a criticism of optimists of you can only see good things even when it is objectively terrible.
Right.
Because this isn't
Yeah.
afterwards that the person is saying, I no longer have my arm. Life is going to be very difficult, be having only one arm from here on out. Instead, in that moment, saying, oh, well, this isn't so bad. At least nobody will ask me if I'm right handed or left handed. Is that even bad? Like, if people ask you if you're right handed or left handed, is anybody
Yeah.
exasperated by this? Where they're just like, I wish I could lose one of these arms before I have another person ask me, what hand do you write with?
Yeah, no, it is. Oh man, that is a good point. I look at it and I'm just like, you know, well, because an optimist might say, well, this isn't too bad. I don't have my left arm anymore, but at least I have my life. At least I have my
Yeah,
other arm. and
Exactly.
all that. But it
Snicket
is,
doesn't get it.
yeah.
This is where Snicket as a character in the story is really fun because
Yeah.
he's so stupid.
Yeah.
But he's like like smart stupid, you know? He
Right.
knows just enough. He knows, okay, there's a difference between being an optimist and being a pessimist. And then he'll get into it and he kind of gets it, and then he just goes off.
Yeah.
It's like he just misses it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah,
Um,
according to that definition, I guess I'm a pessimist because I definitely would scream, "Ah, my arm, my arm,"
oh,
or something
you
along those lines.
weirdo.
I know, very strange of me. And I have to be careful now that I live in Florida. That is actually a real thing that could happen to me.
Right.
An alligator.
Oh dear. Yep. All right. Did you have any more thoughts for chapter two?
Yeah, the only other one that I have, and it's a broader discussion, but I don't really have much commentary on it. But they show up, and this is on page 22, and then they're talking to one of the workers, and then it says, I'll just start with that paragraph towards the top of the page. Klaus gave the note to the man, who was careful not to touch the gum as he read it over. Then he looked down at the orphans with his tired, sawdust-sprinkled eyes. You're going to work here, too? Children working in a lumber mill is a very difficult job. Trees have to be stripped of their bark and sawed into narrow strips to make boards. The boards have to be tied together into stacks and loaded onto trucks. And then, yeah, and then he says, I must tell you that the majority of people who work in the lumber business are grown-ups. Just the majority of them are grown-ups.
Mhm.
But if the owner says you're working here, I guess you're working here, you'd better come inside. And then it continues on page 24. One of the women in the dormitory says, because he tells them, hey, they're going to work here, but they're children. I know, Phil said, but the owner says they're going to work here, so they're going to work here. And that's basically it. It's this theme of child labor. Again, we've seen this. It's a recurring
Mhm.
theme in the books. And the broader discussion that I have about it is that when I took a course in my second year of university on children's literature, and one of the big discussions that we had in the course that my professor brought up, and he kind of went through the history of it, is the history of childhood being distinct from adulthood is a very, very recent notion that
Right.
historically, like this really didn't come out until sometime in the, I think, early to mid 19th century. So it's less than 200 years old. This idea that your childhood is a separate existence from your adulthood. And so if you look at this, before the 19th century, there really was no children's literature.
Right.
There was no distinction between children and adults. Children worked alongside their parents, and especially when you're talking about like the feudal system and agrarian societies, then children, they worked in the fields with their parents. They helped cook, they helped with all kinds of tasks and chores that you had to have, whether it was, gathering wood and, tending to a fire, or cooking, or working in fields, taking care of livestock and other animals and all of that. Children just worked and they were treated like adults, just adults who were physically and intellectually not capable of doing as complex tasks, but they were still tasked with all of these jobs. And then we said, no, 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 they're children. They can't do this, because we started coming up with this very separate division of personhood, which is
Yeah.
children are not allowed to do this. They're not allowed to be in that environment. You can't talk to them about this, because children would just participate in everything that adults did. And some of it would go over their heads and some of it wouldn't. But he's returning to this idea that in this universe in which these books are occupying, where there really isn't much distinction between, at least it breaks down at times, between children and adults.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because sometimes then the adults are like, you wouldn't possibly understand this, you're children. And then other times it's, well, yeah, you might be children, but I'm still going to ask you to do this. Like Mr. Poe, just is like, I'm going to stay on the train. You guys can find your way to
Yeah.
your new guardian. And Sunny, even though she's an infant, Well, you two can take care of her. Violet, you're 14. Klaus, you're, what is he, 12 or something like that?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
You know, like, oh, you're perfectly fine taking care of an infant in a town you've never been in before. And, oh, it's fine for you to work in a mill. It's a little unorthodox, but okay. And I don't really have much to say beyond that, but it's just, he seems to be playing with that history to some degree.
Yeah, no, for sure. It is really interesting that we are getting that uh, uh, yeah, that topic brought up again. And of course, these books are they are coming of age stories, not in the way that we typically think of them, but they are where these children are, learning about the world, learning to take care of themselves. Uh, yeah, just it is interesting. And so to see that in this universe where childhood and adulthood are not really seen as I guess it's sort of just at the point in time, and of course, this is a time-free book series, but it takes place in a time where it would appear that the distinction is just being made between
Yes.
childhood and adulthood.
And
And
it
so,
very much in the tradition of being like a neo-Victorian series,
mhm, yeah,
because the Victorian era is really where you started getting child labor laws and saying, maybe kids shouldn't work in factories. And some people were like, I guess not. And other people are like, well, what else are they going to do? Like, I can't afford to put them in
right,
school,
yeah,
because before you had universal public education, then for poor families, and it's just like, well, I mean, I'm at work, so what am I supposed to do? Just leave them at home by themselves, or come along
right,
with me to the factory and you'll earn a tiny little bit of money and do some help along the way. You know,
right,
provide some
yeah,
help along.
yeah. No, so it is. It's interesting because it's essentially a coming of age story set in that sort of time, um, and it's a very different coming of age story than we're used to, where they are,
Yeah,
um, yeah, they're not being groomed for anything other than just being thrown out into the world and having to figure it out for themselves.
right, right. Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, I think you're right, and I appreciate that because that is one of the themes, and it does seem to be playing on that coming of age approach. So that's all that I have with chapter 2. What do you have?
I just had one other note, which is the introduction to chapter 2 on page 15 going into 16. Uh, and I'd rather not read the whole thing, um, but he says, Lemony Snicket
All
writes,
right.
but when bad news is written down, whether in a letter or a newspaper or on your arm in a felt tip pen, each time you read it, you feel as if you are receiving the news again and again. For instance, I once loved a woman who, for various reasons, uh, could not marry me. If she had simply told me in person, I would have been very sad, of course, but eventually I might have passed. It might have passed. However, she chose instead to write a 200-page book explaining every single detail of the bad news at great length, and instead my sadness has been of impossible depth. When the book was first brought to me by a flock of carrier pigeons, I stayed up all night reading it, and I read it still over and over, and it is as if my darling Beatrice is bringing me bad news every day and every night of my life. Um, Lemony Snicket just needs to not read it anymore.
That's a good
Like
point.
it's such a simple thing of just like, well, then don't read it if it makes you so sad. But I think that it's interesting that he says that it's much worse to receive bad news through the written word. And of course, this is the written word.
And he's constantly telling us that he's going to tell us nothing but awful, bad things happening to the Baudelaires. And
Yeah,
these books are approximately 200 pages in length, just like the letter book that he got from Beatrice. Um,
right. Yeah.
and there certainly is the encouragement to read them again and again, as children do. And
Hmm.
so there's definitely a whole bunch of self-aware playfulness to this. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what, because you're right. It is an interesting part that he talks about, and you are right that if it bothers him that much, then he just shouldn't read it anymore. And I
Yeah.
don't even know how many people would agree with that. That it's much worse to receive bad news through the
Yeah.
written word rather than by somebody simply telling you. Um, I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I suppose like it would be what the bad news is, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's it's a very interesting detail, and I do think your connection to like these books being about 200 pages each, and
yeah,
yeah, that is a great point. It is again, this is one of those punctuations where we get,
yes,
more about Lemony Snicket. It's just enough for us to be like, yes, this is a real person who exists in this world, but it's not enough that we are, you know, yeah, dragged down
right.
by all those details.
And it kind of explains why he's interested in the Baudelaire story because he's got this melancholic spirit that he
Mm,
is somebody who's kind of depressive and he gravitates towards that because you're right that this letter from Beatrice makes him sad, but he continues to read it, and then
yeah,
he's writing these stories, this a series of unfortunate events that have happened to the Baudelaires.
yeah,
Um, and it's like, well, why would you continue to focus in on these unfortunate events? Why not think about happier things? And you're
yeah,
kind of getting a little bit more of, oh, got it, he's you know gone through some tough stuff in his own life, and so he's gravitating towards this.
yeah, yeah. All right, well, that was all that I had for chapter two.
Okay, I will let you go first and last for chapter 3 because I have no notes for it.
Oh, all right then. My first note for chapter three was on page 30. Um, let me see. Uh, yeah, so okay, this is a really odd detail. With Lemony Snicket mentioning this breakfast and and a butler multiple times, whether it's a good day uh, or an okay day, then it is you would still expect there to be a butler there to serve you breakfast.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that he puts it that way. Um, yeah, and I did peek uh, at uh, the author's biography at the back,
Hmm.
uh, and it does say that Lemony Snicket. Uh, he says he has no wife or children, only enemies, associates, and the occasional loyal manservant. And it's like, oh, so he actually has a butler, which is like
Right.
really interesting
So he
that
just
they,
takes it for granted that of course everybody has a butler.
right, yeah, yeah, it's very interesting to see that. Oh, and then of course we do have the definition of cacophony, a word which here means the sound of two metal pots being banged together by a nasty foreman standing at the doorway holding no breakfast at all.
Right.
Just fun there.
Right.
Yes. All right. And next is page 32. Um, uh, yeah, once they got a good look at Foreman Flacatono, they wanted to hop back into their bunks and pull the covers over their heads. Um, so yeah, they do have an instant recognition to Foreman Flacatono,
Yes.
which is good to see. But it's interesting that we don't get any direct um, mention of him being Count Olaf or anything like that.
No, you're right. It doesn't say that, which is then presuming that the readers are going are expecting this. They're going to
Mhm.
recognize this. So the point doesn't need to be belabored by Snicket.
Yeah,
Perhaps that's the way to interpret this because we know, even like children reading this, they know that it's Count Olaf, that he's going to show up at some point in this story. And of course, with this whole, the clues are all there, that the previous foreman had quit only, a week or two prior to their arrival, and all of this. Yeah.
So that was my only other note for chapter 3.
Okay. It makes me wonder, though, the timeline of this, and I know that it's really not important, but how long has it been from when the wide window ended to the beginning of this book? Because it must have been at least a week, right? Because what does it say about the foreman? When did he get replaced?
Yeah, I think it does say a week ago. Yeah.
And so, because if it was a week ago, but like if this book takes place like the next day after the wide window, right? So they're left on the dock with Mr. Poe. Count Olaf runs off with the androgynous person, right?
Right.
And then they spend maybe a night at Mr. Poe's house and then get on a train because he sets them up with this next group. That means that when Count Olaf had thrown Aunt Josephine out the window, or even before that, he had already orchestrated this plan to get the other foreman to quit so that way he could replace him, and then he would be there the entire time when he was also Captain Sham. So you go, there's a full week in between, but there's no mention of the fact that they went back to Mr. Poe's house again with his kids, and they stayed there for a week again. There's no, it's an interesting, I'm not going to bother with explaining how much time there is in between these things, but it seems important because if they're staying at his place for upwards of a week, aren't they in between these books? Haven't they then spent more time at Mr. Poe's house than they have with any of these guardians? Because it's always 2 or 3 days with these people.
Yeah, no, I would definitely say that they seem to have spent more time at Mr. Poe's than with any other guardian. There is also the question of how is Count Olaf figuring out
where they're going to go next?
Yeah. He is apparently doing the exact same research as Mr. Poe and is just ahead of him.
Right.
It would seem. Who's their next closest living relative?
Yeah. And he's very good at predicting this of where they'll be too. Okay. All right. So let's move on to chapter 4. So I've got 2 notes in there. But one of them, it connects back to page 2 of the book. So I'll just give the first one that I have because it's just a brief little comment. So this is on page 56, and it's the last paragraph on that page where Charles, he then offers the kids the peach that he has in his hand. And because they're starving, because they only had, they had no breakfast and then chewing gum for their lunch. And then Sunny didn't even have that at all because she's just a baby. So then he offers them the peach. And then Klaus takes it. He says, "Oh, thank you," Klaus cried, and hurriedly divided the peach among himself and his siblings, giving the biggest piece to Sunny because she hadn't even had her gum. The Baudelaire children wolfed down the peach, and under normal circumstances it would not been polite to eat something so quickly and so noisily, blah, 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 blah. Okay, my question is, how do you divide a peach?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering the same thing.
Thank you. He hands Klaus a peach. Think about it. I dare you to get a peach and then divide it into thirds with your bare hands. There's no way you can do this.
Yeah.
It doesn't say. And then he pulled out a pocket knife that he had and sliced it into thirds, or it was already sliced, and so then he gave 2 slices to Sunny and 1 to him. It's just he divided it just
Yep, no, absolutely.
Anyone can answer that question. I'm really interested. How do you divide a peach with your bare hands?
Yeah, send us proper instructions and maybe in a video.
Yes, exactly. I want. How there's always these YouTube videos or other video platforms of people saying you've been cutting this fruit wrong your entire life, and then they show you how to actually cut it up. That's what I want to know with this peach.
Yep.
All right. So what do you have?
Sorry, go ahead.
But that's all that, like, I've got that and then one other comment for chapter 4, but I want to hear yours first.
All right. So yeah, I had two comments for this chapter. The one is the nice little twist on page 50 of Charles not being their guardian, because previously we have
Yeah.
only, seen their guardians other than Count Olaf.
Yeah.
Then we've only seen their guardians be very jovial, friendly, nice people
Yeah.
who are looking out for them. And this time, then of course they assume that the nice person is their guardian, and
Right.
it is not. And having
Right.
Sir actually be their guardian, who
Yes.
forces them to work in the mill, it's like, wow, okay, yeah, Count Olaf is terrible and constantly after them, but not every guardian is going to be a good guardian.
Yeah. Good point.
um, yeah, I mean, of course, we did get uh, a little bit of that description in The Wide Window with Aunt Josephine not being a good guardian,
Hmm.
but this is to a complete different extreme.
Yes.
And so that's sort of what I was talking about before, where it's an interesting twist where their guardian is not actually the nice, friendly person who just so happens to be oblivious. Their
Right.
guardian wants nothing to do with them in this
Right.
case. He's just
Right.
like, you're going to work for me for a few years, free labor for me, basically, and that's it. And yeah, um, so I like that. And then on page 53 is my other note. Let me see, where was it? Um, we get the description of a fair deal. If you were bored playing with your chemistry set and you gave it to your brother in exchange for his dollhouse, that would be a fair deal. Very odd, decision to have that be the example, but whatever. If someone offered to smuggle me out of the country in her sailboat in exchange for free tickets to an ice show, that would be a fair deal. Okay, so he's clearly talking about a specific instance here, which is not a
Mm.
surprise.
Hmm.
But with him mentioning the sailboat, I don't know about you, but it instantly made me think of Aunt Josephine.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I didn't catch that when I was first reading it, but you're right. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, just a little bit more about Lemony Snicket being an outlaw and, being uh yeah, trying to get out of the country and whatever. But yeah, the sailboat in particular makes me really think, oh, well, we just had a story about
Okay.
sailboats.
Okay. So let's do one of these ridiculous fan theories. All right. Here we go, people. If this has not happened before, then I'm going to drop it for the first time. Aunt Josephine is still alive, and she has smuggled herself out of the country on one of Captain Sham's sailboats. And that is the clue, right? If someone
Mhm.
offered to smuggle me out of the country in her sailboat in exchange for free tickets to an ice show, that would be a fair deal. Because we last saw her on a sinking sailboat and we didn't see the body, and she very well could have, uh, gotten back to shore, and then Captain Sham has abandoned that business. She could have taken one of those sailboats, but because she's so terrified of him and everything else, she would want to escape. And
Yeah.
so she then escapes on this boat, and she had been in touch with Lemony Snicket, who then she said, "Hey, if you'll I'll smuggle you out of the country too. I'll give you tickets to an ice show." She's still alive, and that's our proof.
Yeah, yeah. No, that sounds about as believable as most fan theories.
Right,
So,
because that's what fan theories are like. All these fan theories on the internet, they read just like that. Um,
yeah, yeah. I'm not saying like it's definitely Aunt Josephine, but it is just
no, no, no.
interesting that we do
It
get
is an
that.
interesting little thing because yeah, we just had that entire storyline involving sailboats, and then saying
Yeah.
her and all of that. Yeah, it's interesting.
Hmm.
So
But yeah, that was my only other note.
great. So because and that works well with what I have. So I'm on the same page and in that exact same passage that it says a fair deal, as everyone knows, is when both people give something of more or less equal value. If you were bored with playing with your chemistry set and you gave it to your brother in exchange for his dollhouse, that would be a fair deal. Okay, who's he talking to here? Is he talking to a boy or a girl? What do you think? Like, and it's not a
Uh,
trick question.
yeah, I honestly I didn't really think about it. I was thinking boy, but it definitely makes more sense, I guess, from a uh, stereotypical perspective for
That
him to be
he's
talking to a girl.
right, because he's flipping the stereotype there. He's saying your brother, who's got
Hmm.
his dollhouse, right?
Hmm.
So you, being a girl, of course you have the chemistry set, but you're tired of it because you already have done all of the experiments you want to do, let's say, with your chemistry set. It's
Right.
not uh because it's not like this person has never played with it. If you were bored with playing with your chemistry set and you gave it to your brother in exchange for his dollhouse, that would be a fair deal. So it's like, so when he says, if you were bored, he's talking directly to the reader here. And there definitely seems to be the implication. I really believe the implication is the reader is a girl. And
Mm.
then her brother might have a dollhouse. And it's like, this is kind of like, he's, it's essentially a feminist critique of expectations of saying,
Right.
of course you would expect that the boy would have the, if you say you've got two kids, a boy and a girl, one of them has a chemistry set, one of them has a dollhouse, which one has the chemistry set and which one has the dollhouse? You would say, well, of course it's the boy who has the chemistry set and the girl who has the dollhouse. And he's saying, aha, I got you, you're a misogynist, that like
Right.
the boy has the dollhouse and then they exchange, because why can't a boy play with a dollhouse or a chemistry set and vice versa with the girl? But he's speaking directly to the reader saying, if you were bored with it. So I'm saying, okay, are you assuming then, or presuming, that your reader is a girl here and that she has a brother? And then turn back to page 2. So if you
Hmm.
go back to page 2, it says, because he's, well, I guess we'll go with page 1 when he gives these other examples of different stories. He says that for instance, a book that began with the sentence, once upon a time there was a family of cunning little chipmunks who lived in a hollow tree, would probably contain a story full of talking animals who get into all sorts of mischief. A book that began with the sentence, Emily sat down and looked at the stack of blueberry pancakes her mother had prepared for her, but she was too nervous about Camp Timbertops to eat a bite, would probably contain a story full of giggly girls who had a grand old time. Okay, so this story of girls who are going to go off to a summer camp together, they're going to have a grand old time because that's fun. That's a nice story. And a book that began with the sentence, Gary smelled the leather of his brand new catcher's mitt and waited impatiently for his best friend Larry to come around the corner, would probably contain a story full of sweaty boys who win some sort of trophy. You see how it
Yeah.
gets less specific? Just some sort of trophy. That's not really important, but it's very specific with the girl, with Emily. She's too nervous because she's about to go off to Camp Timbertops. Not, oh, some girl who's gonna go like do stupid things with her girlfriends and they'll like giggle and whatever at some summer camp. It's not
Right.
dismissive, but the story about the boy with the catcher's mitt is very dismissive, and then saying that they're
Hmm.
sweaty boys, a story full of sweaty boys, and you're like, yeah, yeah. I wouldn't want to read that story because boys are gross and they're sweaty, right? I'm like, okay, between that and then what you have on page 53 with this whole talking directly to the reader, I'm going, are these books intended for girls?
Hmm.
That
Yeah,
is
that
my
is really
question.
interesting.
And I kind of think, yes, at least from this evidence, looking at this, because as a boy, I mean, I can still pull out a lot of my books from when I would have been, a middle grade reader, so, somewhere between grades 4 to 6 to 7,
Hmm.
which is approximately what these books are intended for. Uh, I definitely, like, I've got tons of baseball books of boys who play baseball and they are working towards, the Little League World Series. And like, I guess they're sweating, but it's not full of sweaty boys. Like, ew,
Right.
ugh. It's boys who are working so hard to play as a team and develop their baseball skills. Cause like I was obsessed with baseball. And so I look at this and I'm like, how dare you? Those are my books. I love that. They're not full of sweaty boys who want to win some sort of trophy. I'd be like, oh, well, you're not writing this for me then, or for a lot of boys who do like reading about sports. Um,
Right.
but it's saying a book that's about girls going off to summer camp together. Ooh, that they're going to have a grand old time. Don't you want to read a story about people who have a grand old time and not a story full of sweaty boys who win some sort of trophy? And I'm going,
Yeah, that
huh, I didn't catch that until now. And I wonder if these books are more popular with girls. I definitely know more girls than boys who have read these books.
hmm,
I don't know
really
about you.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't even really know. Like, I haven't really spoken to other people about these books, but yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's something seriously up with that, and
Hmm.
I don't know that he initially started with that, but maybe because this is the fourth book in the series, doing enough events, doing enough author appearances and things like that, I wonder if he
Right.
had kind of picked it up along the way of, oh, I'm getting like an 80-20 split of girls versus boys who love these books. Like, I don't
Hmm.
know. I genuinely don't know. And if somebody can answer that question for me, if these are, more popular with girls than boys, because I never thought of it. I just thought, like, well, you've got Violet and you've got Klaus.
Hmm.
And you get them both being very active in these stories, and they both have got complementary skills where they're not
Yeah.
competing with each other and they cooperate. So I'm like, I could see boys reading this and identifying very much with Klaus, and girls reading this and identifying with Violet. Or if not, the kids are not identifying, they're at least admiring these
Hmm.
characteristics that you have because they're both such clever kids. Um, but then I'm looking at this going, are you getting disparaging towards boys? And you're saying, like, listen, girls, it's just us here who are going to talk,
Right.
because that's how it feels.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is really interesting. Huh.
Yeah. I don't know if somebody can comment on that. I would appreciate it because I am genuinely curious whether it's just anecdotal evidence of people who've read these books, what's the split, and if there's anything more substantive than that, where you can say that, oh yeah, these definitely started getting marketed more and more towards girls, um, or not. Maybe that's not
Hmm.
the case, but it's very suspicious.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could definitely see these books being more popular with girls. I mean, even with the style of them,
Yep.
like it's not necessarily something that uh, a boy would be drawn to.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. And I mean, I can say this as an English teacher, and I've worked as, with grades as young as seventh grade, and the issues surrounding literacy for boys and younger boys from middle grade getting into, like the young adult reading years, but, from those ages and all the way through high school, boys have much more issues. They've got much lower literacy rates. They are much more likely to be reluctant readers where they don't enjoy reading. And so, what you do, one of the strategies to get boys to read more is to get them high concept, low vocab. Those are
mm,
the books that you aim at. Lots of pictures, very low vocabulary. You're not giving them complex words, not a lot of wordplay, not a lot of like puns and things like that. But a car that's like full of like glossy photographs of sports cars, or muscle cars, or adventure stuff, like outdoor adventure things or sports, things like that. Even like something like Guinness Book of World Records, right? Lots of pictures. It doesn't take that long to read one of the entries, and it's very obvious what's going on. But something like this is all about the playfulness of language,
yeah.
and it's in this, and it's kind of historical fiction, and
Right.
like, I mean, generally speaking, these are gender stereotypes, but generally speaking, most boys don't say, yeah, like, I love stuff from the 19th century with the way men used to dress with the different fashion. But you hear like girls like will they love, like, and this is a gender stereotype. So I'm saying this does not necessarily hold up, and we can certainly criticize it. But the idea of, oh, like Little Women is great because, like, looking at like the fashion and their dresses, and
Right.
Anne of Green Gables, and boys don't really like that stuff of, oh, I love reading about Victorian fashion amongst boys and etiquette and whether he's going to ask the girl to the dance. They're like, give me somebody dying in the woods who's got a hatchet. Right? Gary Paulson book, Hatchet. You know, like, give me like something like that where it's like life or death and it's survival. And so I don't think they would necessarily appeal to boys the way they would to girls, but I didn't catch it until now. That at least Handler is kind of thinking about this.
Yeah. No, that is fascinating. Man, changes the way that I look at these books.
Yeah, me too. Me too, because that's why I wanted to wait until the end to talk about it, because I think it's so interesting. And I know, and I think in part because I'm not always the best representative to catch that, because I read everything when I was a kid. Like, I read all those super, masculine, marketed towards boys books. But I also read our older sister, Amanda. I read a whole bunch of books that she had, like the Babysitter Club books. Like, I read those like crazy. Like, I think I even probably read some like Sweet Valley High. Like, I just read everything I could. And I didn't make any distinction between them. But most boys, like, would not read any of that stuff. So I'm saying I'm not always the best for catching that, because I would have read, like, I wouldn't have been turned away by these books. I think, after I started reading, I might have not enjoyed them that much, but not because I would think they're too feminine.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really interesting, especially, having Klaus be the reader.
Yep.
That it's portraying the boy
and
as
doesn't that
the
make
academic.
Right, but not just as an academic, because Violet is an academic as well. But he's flipping gender stereotypes here. But initially I thought he was just flipping it with Violet. That you think that I guess I did think that it is flipped between the two of them. That if you've got a boy and a girl, then you would think that the girl is going to be more of a reader, and then the boy is going to be more into, well, I read, but I read practical things like mechanical engineering. Right? But then it's like, well, I'll get the girl to be the engineer and the boy will be the reader. But I didn't think that much about the boy being a reader as being a flipped stereotype, gender stereotype. But now I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely what he's doing. Yeah. That Violet is taking on that traditionally masculine role of being much more mechanically inclined and, having a mind for engineering. And then Klaus is the reader, because reading itself, and because I've thought about this a lot, in part as being an English teacher and sitting on literacy team meetings and working with other educators on what can we do to improve the literacy of boys in our school and with these grades as they move up. And part of the issue, as I've read more and more about it, is that reading is such a passive activity, and it is sedentary, it's solitary, and it's passive. It's not competitive. And boys tend to be competitive. Boys tend to be more active. They like moving around more. They tend to be more tactile. And girls do tend towards those activities, generally speaking. Then reading ends up being more of a feminine thing to do, or at least a female, as far as sex is, a female thing to do. And so it's curious.
So I guess I had thought, that by flipping that, then he was, trying to make these books appeal more to boys, because it's like, look, if you're a reader, you can be like Klaus.
Yes.
But in fact, then it's more, I would say, isn't Klaus so cute? And he's a reader just like you.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. I think you're right.
Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. What is the role of Klaus in this? Is it to be like some kind of role model for boys, or is it for girls to go, I wish I could find a boy who just loves curling up with a book as well?
Yeah. And this book in particular, with Klaus on the cover.
He's even puckering up.
Yeah.
Some little girl who's just like, oh my, he's so whatever, dreamy. Look at him.
Yeah,
because that's not gonna, from a marketing standpoint, I think, and just in case you folks are not catching on here, from a marketing standpoint, I feel like you'd have a pretty hard time convincing somebody in a marketing team, like in a marketing department, this is going to appeal to boys.
Right.
Put a
Yeah.
boy wearing like an unfurled bow tie with a collared shirt, big round glasses, and certainly a Victorian aesthetic on the cover where he's got a suit on and just
Mhm.
just say, yeah, 10-year-old boys, 11-year-old boys, they're going to devour these books, right?
Right. Yeah.
I maybe we're just idiots and like it takes until now for us to catch it, but I just did not catch who the reader is. I just thought it was kids in general. But looking at that
Yeah.
going, I don't think Handler thinks that, at least not anymore by the fourth
Mm.
book. It definitely seems to be, yeah, boys are gross. And it's just us girls, even though he's not a girl, but it's just us girls who are reading these books. I'm talking directly to you, a girl. And
Yeah.
because there's no sympathy for boys in that, in at least those descriptions that I brought out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is really, really interesting to see these now from that perspective. Yeah, because I guess like I was sort of drawn to these books because of the Tim Burton-esque,
Right.
twist on things, right?
Yeah,
It's
that
like a
makes
little
sense.
off and everything. So I really liked that about them. Um, but yeah, from the girl perspective,
Mm.
using girl, then it would be, oh, this is a book that's not a girly book. Do you
Right.
know? Where they would be okay reading this because they'd be like, oh, well, this is actually like a little bit of a more of a boys' book that
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading. And
Mm.
so that's actually really, really interesting to see it from that perspective, how he's not directly saying this is for girls, but that it might be appealing to girls specifically because
Mm-hmm.
it's not saying that it's for girls.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, and that is interesting because we target towards, I say we, and I mean collectively as a society, but then specifically within publishing, when you're talking about middle grade books very often, and especially if it's a series, they will get divided, and you could just tell just by the color scheme on them, meant for boys, meant for girls. These are meant for
Hmm.
boys, these are meant for girls. These, to me, seemed fairly neutral.
Hmm.
That but the more I think about it, the more I'm suspicious about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And once again, we should, say that just because they may be intended or marketed toward girls does not mean that it's just for girls. Like
No,
these can be read and enjoyed by boys just as much as girls. It does not matter what your gender identity is
no,
or anything like that. Like they are still fun books for kids of this age. And
yeah. Well,
yeah,
I
it,
mean, like I
it is just
say,
interesting from a marketing perspective to
from a
see how
marketing,
they're.
but also from the like looking at Handler and who
Mhm.
he's writing to, because he's talking
Yeah.
directly to readers and he seems to be talking specifically to girls. And
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I'm saying because like I'm repeating myself here, but I legitimately I read everything when I was younger. I continue to read like just about everything, but I'm a little bit more selective in what I read now, just because there's so much that I want to read that
Right.
I choose the stuff that I know I'm going to most enjoy most of the time is how I choose books. But yeah, like I read lots of stuff that was marketed specifically to girls, and I didn't care. And like I
Yeah.
had like occasionally, and then some people would be like, "You did that? You read that book?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Like it, I'm like I'm so masculine. I'm like, "What? You want to fight?" Like I don't
Right.
care. I'll read
Yeah.
anything. And just because you're so intimidated by reading something that's got a girl on the cover, like that says that you're a weak dude. That doesn't say that you're tough. And it's like,
Yeah.
and I was like really rough and tumble as a kid. So like nobody was going to actually challenge me on it. But like I'm saying, like it
Right.
doesn't like legitimately anybody who's reading this, like I don't feel like anybody should think meant more for girls, meant more for boys. Um,
Hmm.
but I am really interested in the fact that Handler seems to be thinking that he's talking to one gender and not the other.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we should wrap this up.
Yep.
But we will be continuing on next week. Will be chapters 5 to 8, where we will see what happens in this miserable mill.
Yes.
And potentially see what the I building is all about.
Yeah. I hope that Mike Wazowski lives in there.
That would be great.
That house should be painted green, and it's just Mike Wazowski in there. He's like,
Yes.
"What do you want?" All right, folks. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.
Bye.
Ignore the tattoo! A phrase here which means like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast across the web. That may seem like a strange definition, but in this context, it is entirely accurate.